Really want us over these next few weeks in the build up to Christmas just to spend some real quality time reflecting on the miracle of what God has done through Christ in the Christmas events. And if you're here with us this morning and you enjoy Christmas, but you wouldn't necessarily call yourself a Christian, I really hope that you go away catching hold of something maybe that you've never seen before or understood before. This is a wonderful time of year for us, isn't it? When we sing some amazing truth and focus on what God has done. And it's just a wonderful opportunity for us in the midst of all the kind of stuff that goes on around us in the culture as God's people to engage with Him through His Son and enjoy afresh reflecting on what He's done for us, this incredible work that Jesus has done. And we're all very familiar, aren't we, with the challenges in our world today. I mean, we have 24/7 news feeds confronting us with, it seems, one world crisis after another. I don't know whether you feel a bit overwhelmed by that. You certainly should do. Amazing access that we've got to information, and yet the amount of crises that we seem to be facing is it can feel overwhelming. I wonder if it were possible for you to elect someone to sort the mess out, someone that would be given unlimited resources and someone that would have unlimited power in our world. What kind of person would you elect to that kind of role? I wonder what would be the kind of qualities at the top of your list for the person or the leader to take on that kind of challenge and mission. What would be your top 5 character qualifications for someone to deal with some of the most desperate challenges that we're facing in our world today? I wonder whether there's someone from history or someone currently alive that you think should be the person to deal with our deepest human problems. I wonder who it might be. Maybe one of the faces that you see there, maybe not. Well, today, of course, we are beginning a season of Advent, a few Sundays as we work towards what happens on the 25th when we celebrate the arrival of Christ. And it's a time of countdown in a way, isn't it? It's a time of expectation, anticipation. It's a time when we build up towards one of the most significant events in all of human history, actually. Whatever culture, whatever nation we might be from. We do that, don't we, for 24 days. Kids, I don't know if you've started to open your Advent calendars. Anyone begun to open the calendar? Yep, great. I wonder what you've got in there. All sorts of Advent calendars around, creative Advent calendars around. Sadly, we've got our Advent calendar up, but it's one of those ones that you put things in, little pockets that you put things in, and we just haven't got round yet to populating it, so it's empty. But our kids, they're not really kids anymore, but they do enjoy Advent calendars still. They'll get about 3 or 4 days blessing on the first day. So it's Advent. It's when we're looking towards the Christmas events. And we do that, don't we, in a sense that we are looking back to something that happened 2,000 years ago in the Middle East when Christ was born in Bethlehem, as the carol goes. And of course, at this season, we reflect on and we retell those events in all sorts of ways, don't we? We do that in our songs that we sing, the carols that we sing. We retell the events through nativity dramas and plays. I don't know, kids, you've got maybe nativity plays at school and things like that planned. We look back to what happened in human history 2,000 years ago when Christ arrived. But you know, for hundreds of years before that happened, the people of God were looking not backwards but forwards in time, in anticipation for those key critical events. And prophets within the people of God, within Israel, spoke of the events that were to happen. They prophesied about the Messiah who was to come. That was the technical term that was used for this arrival. They sang of a deliverer in their psalms. They prophesied out of their visions. They looked forward to a time in human history when God would send the Messiah. And in the build-up to Christmas over these next 3 mornings, I just want us to reflect on one of those prophetic songs. It's in a book in the Bible, in the Old Testament, called Isaiah, or Isaiah, if you're in, US mode. He is an Old Testament prophet, one of what's called the major prophets, who lived 700 years before the birth of Christ. And he prophesied over a period of about 40 years. Had a very long, prolonged ministry. He lived about 250 years after what was something of the high point in the nation of Israel under the reign of King David and then his son, King Solomon. But since the reign of David and Solomon, things had begun to fall apart within the nation. It was a time mostly of decline. The nation had begun to fragment. Kings had come and gone. It was a bit hit and miss, but mostly miss in terms of the rulers that Israel had. And Isaiah prophesies. And one of the themes of his visions was the coming king, the servant king, the Messiah. He prophesied during the reign of 4 kings. He began at the point at which Uzziah died. Isaiah 6 records that moment of encounter where in the year that Uzziah died, Isaiah says, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, lofty on his throne. And the cherubim cried, holy, holy, holy. That's where his ministry began, an encounter with the holy God of Israel. At the end of what was a very long reign, Uzziah, I think 52 years, pretty good king, but now he'd gone. And in that moment, Isaiah sees the Lord. God, through the cherubim, touches his lips and says, now go and begin to speak, Isaiah, begin to prophesy. And Isaiah, as all prophets do, spoke into the immediate situation, the political situation, the historic situation of his day. And he puts his finger on the underlying issues, spiritual issues, in the life of God's people that are leading to the decline. Prophets put their finger on things. They spotlight things in a way that at times can make us feel quite uncomfortable. That's what Isaiah does. But along with dealing with the immediate situation, Isaiah, through his visions and prophecies, points to a future age, points to future events. And so what's clear in Isaiah's prophecies is that whilst he is addressing God's old covenant community, Israel, the scope of what he sees in his visions as God reveals the future to him is far wider than just the nation of Israel and this particular moment in their history together. These aren't just promises for the future of Israel, but for the future of all nations. And so Isaiah prophesies about Israel being a light to the nations. He speaks of how one day the shroud that covers all nations, the burial shroud of death, will one day be removed from all nations. These aren't just prophecies and promises for a particular people in a particular time in history. These are visions of God's intention for the whole of humanity and the heavens and the earth. They aren't just prophecies and promises regarding an earthly city of Jerusalem, but for what that city foreshadows, a heavenly city, the new covenant church made up of Jews and Gentiles. So Isaiah prophesies about the mountain of the Lord being lifted up as chief among the mountains, and all nations streaming up to it. The kingdom that he sees and prophesies about isn't just some future political state. It's a different kind of kingdom that will stretch to the very ends of the earth. And so Isaiah prophesies about an age, a time, a coming kingdom when the lion will lie down next to the lamb, when the little toddler will play near the hole of the cobra, when defense spending will end and the machinery of war will be irrelevant, when swords will be beaten into plowshares, an age where there will be no more hostility, no more war. Don't you long for that age, that kingdom? This is what Isaiah foresees. This is what he brings to the people. He speaks into the immediate situation, but he foresees a coming age that is way beyond the scope of the nation of Israel at that moment of their history. He sees a new age that is marked by a new covenant. You know, Isaiah is the most quoted Old Testament prophet in the New Testament. And one of the themes of his prophecies is the promise of a servant king who would come. Every kingdom needs a king, doesn't it? There's no such thing as a kingdom without a king. One of the problems we face in our day, in our modern post-Christian world, is that everyone wants the kingdom, but no one wants the king. We want social justice. We want an end to the horrifying war and suffering. We want the poor to receive dignity, to be fed. We want the kingdom, but we don't want the king. Well, at the heart of the prophecies of Isaiah is the king who is at the heart of the coming kingdom. And as Isaiah prophesies about this individual, it's very mysterious. Alec Motyer in his commentary says that there's an enigma. There's a Messiah enigma. Because on the one hand, this figure is described at times as a very flesh and blood, human individual. He's the son of David. He's a flesh and blood individual. He's a human being. And yet at other times, he's described as having the very attributes of God himself, the hand of the Lord. He's described as being, on the one hand, triumphant and victorious, but at other times as being incredibly vulnerable and experiencing terrible personal, physical suffering, having his beard plucked from his face, being lashed. It's a mysterious portrait. Who is this king? Alec Motyer says he's a Messiah who is plainly man and truly God. And that's what we celebrate at Christmas, the arrival of this servant king. Take, for example, Isaiah 9:6. For to us a child is born. To us a son is given. And the government shall be on his shoulder. And his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. The Messiah enigma. A son, a child, a baby, a newborn, in a manger. A flesh and blood human being who needs feeding and cleaning and teaching. And yet his name will be Wonderful Counselor, Everlasting Father, Powerful God. This is the servant king that Isaiah prophesies of. And we're going to look at one of what's called the servant songs. There are 4 of them, poems or songs that describe this individual. The one we're going to look at over the next few Sundays is Isaiah chapter 42, and it goes like this. Behold my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit on him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry aloud or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a faintly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not grow faint or be discouraged till he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his joy, wait for his law. A prophecy by an 8th century prophet in Israel. This is the Iron Age in the Middle East. What on earth has this got to do with Christmas? Well, like we've said, the baby in the manger that we look back to is the one that the prophets spoke of and sang of. And you know, that's what Jesus himself claimed about himself. In Luke 24, after the resurrection, he spends time with his disciples, and it says that he began with Moses and the prophets, and he interpreted to them the things in the Old Testament scriptures concerning himself. Matthew 12, if you've got a Bible, why not turn there? Matthew 12, verse 15 to 21. This very servant song is quoted by Matthew in his gospel. So we read in Matthew 12, verse 15. Jesus, aware of this is Matthew's gospel, withdrew from there, and many followed him, and he healed them all and ordered them not to make him known. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. Behold my servant whom I've chosen. And he quotes what we've just read. This prophecy from 700 years before the birth of Christ. So the most important question we can ever ask ourselves really is, who is Jesus? Who is this servant king? And that's the answer really that Isaiah is giving us. He's giving it to us in advance, pointing ahead 700 years to the birth of Christ. How does he answer that question in this servant song? Well, he speaks of 3 things that we're going to look at over the coming weeks. He speaks of the identity of this individual. Who is he? Speaks of his mission. What's his plan? And he speaks of his character as well. What's he like? So we're going to look this morning at his identity. Who is he? There's a number of things here that the prophet says about the identity of this promised servant king. First thing he says is that he's God's servant. You know, for us, the term servant, or actually slave, is an incredibly loaded term, isn't it? To a Western culture and to Western eyes that increasingly tend to see things in terms of power, oppressed and oppressors. The word servant can sound almost a demeaning term, as if there's something inherently dehumanizing about being a servant. But here, however, it's not used in that way. It's a term full of dignity. It describes the relationship of this Messiah to God himself, the God of Israel, Yahweh. He is the Lord's servant. I wonder what qualities were on your list when I asked you that question a little while ago. What top qualities would be on your list for electing someone to the role of dealing with the problems that we face as humanity? I wonder if servanthood was one of those. This is the very first thing we learn about this individual. World history, of course, is littered with examples of those who have misused their power and authority. Israel's own history was full of individuals like that. Isaiah, as I said, lived through the reign of 4 kings, and none of them really lived up to expectations. None of them were model servants. Some served their own interests. Others were driven by fear. Some were better than others. But ultimately, every king of Israel and Judah fell short in some way, some more than others. Every king that had been anointed with oil and set apart to rule disappointed. And of course, leaders continue to disappoint. Even David, the best of the best, ended up serving his own self-centered desires. But here Isaiah speaks of one who is to come, who will be the ultimate servant, who will not disappoint. That will be his distinctive identity. Someone who won't wield power in order to serve his own interests. Someone who won't be corrupted by the authority that he carries. Someone who will literally live to serve Yahweh, the Lord. The servant of the Lord. Behold, my servant, Isaiah says. It's a phrase, of course, that Israel was familiar with. It had been used to describe David himself. It had been used to describe Moses. But now it is applied to the one that Isaiah looks forward into the future and prophesies of. The one that we, from where we are in our moment of history, look back to and celebrate at Christmas. And so as we think about the child in the manger, as we ask the question, who is he? Behold, my servant, is the way that Isaiah answers that question. The Christmas events then mark for us the arrival of this servant, and that's exactly how the New Testament apostles interpret those events for us. Philippians 2, verse 6, Paul says this. He says, though he was in the form of God, he did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. You see, for all eternity, the servant had known in his status and privilege as God the Son the worship and service of all creation, including archangels and angels. Colossians says that all things were made through him and for him. The whole thing is set up to serve him. And yet in the Christmas events that we celebrate, he doesn't count those privileges and rights as something to be clung on to, but he makes himself one of us. He comes in the form of a servant. And Jesus again and again underlined this. Luke 22:27, I am among you as one who serves. And then, of course, just before his betrayal and arrest, as they arrive for the evening meal in the upper room, we find that Jesus takes off his robe, takes the towel, gets down on his hands and his knees, and begins to wash his disciples' feet. He's the servant king. That's at the heart of who he is. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why the Jews failed to recognize him as the promised Messiah. You see, servanthood wasn't in their top 5 qualifications of what the Messiah should be like. He's a servant king. And I think, at the moment, in an age when our Western cultures that we're growing up in are increasingly marked by a spirit of entitlement and personal autonomy, this is such a challenging aspect of the Messiah that we follow and serve. At a time when it's seen as a very basic human right to be able to pursue your own agenda, to enjoy health, wealth, and happiness, and even to choose your own identity, to become the person that you want to become, the message and the model of servanthood is profoundly challenging. But it's at the heart of the identity of the King that we confess. And it's at the heart of what we are called to as we follow him. No servant's greater than his master. The Jesus that we follow, the one that we devote ourselves to and worship at Christmas time. Take, for instance, this saying of Jesus is I know if you're familiar with some of the parables, this is one actually that doesn't get much airtime. This is what Jesus says on one occasion to his followers. He says, "Which one of you, having a servant tending sheep or plowing, will say to him when he comes in from the field, 'Come at once and sit down and eat'? Instead, will he not tell him, 'Prepare something for me to eat, get ready, and serve me while I eat and drink, and later you can eat and drink'? Does he thank that servant because he did what was commanded? In the same way, when you have done all that you were commanded, you should say, 'We're unworthy servants. We've only done our duty.'" Don't often hear that very counter-cultural message of Jesus and what it means to be a disciple. I mean, doesn't it mean that we get to enjoy now perfect health, prosperity, happiness, freedom from trouble and suffering and affliction and difficulty? When you've done all that you were commanded, you should say, "We're unworthy servants. We've only done our duty." And when we come on that final day, face to face with this servant king, that reality and perspective will be so ingrained within us, won't it? When we see his glory, we will look back on a lifetime full of, I trust, investment in his kingdom, serving the body of his church, reaching the unreached that he longs to reach, the pouring out of our lives for the extension of this kingdom. I will say, "Lord, we're just unworthy servants. We've only done our duty." So he's the servant king. We sang it, didn't we? "From heaven you came, helpless babe, entered our world, your glory veiled. Not to serve, not to be served, but to serve and give your life that we may live." So he's God's servant king. Second thing we find out here is that along with this, he's God's beloved son. Isaiah goes on to say, "My chosen one, in whom my soul delights." You see, on the one hand, he is God's servant, but that doesn't mean that he's just like a tool in the hand of the Lord. Quite the opposite. Here we discover that this servant is the object of the Lord's delight and pleasure. It's a hint at what becomes much more clearly developed in the New Testament. That at the heart of who God is love. God is love. And that is possible because God does not exist as a single entity, a single sovereign, exalted being, but as a trinity of persons. And along with the person of the Holy Spirit, we have the person of the Father and the person of the Son. And they have for all eternity existed as an interpersonal community, if you like, marked by love and mutual delight and pleasure in one another. And you know, that is totally unique. There is no other religion that conceives of God in that way. There are religions that conceive of God as personal, as having a will and a mind that needs to be submitted to. That's a Muslim conception of God. And there are religions that see God as non-personal or impersonal, God as a force or a principle. And therefore without a mind or a will. But only Christianity conceives of a God who is both personal and plural. A God who is capable of eternal love. That's unique to the message that we have, to what we believe as Christians. We believe in a God of eternal, interpersonal relationship and love. And this servant king is the object of Yahweh's love, the Father's love and delight. He's a beloved son. He is completely, thoroughly, and fully loved. And that is at the heart, of course, of the message of the gospel. For God so loved the world that he gave his son, that whoever believes in him would have eternal life. Jesus himself was very aware of the fact that he enjoyed the Father's love. We find at his baptism, a voice from heaven says, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I'm well pleased." Not just Yahweh's servant, but the beloved Son. We find at the moment of the transfiguration, the same utterance from heaven. A voice from the cloud that says, "This is my beloved Son." John 5 verse 20, Jesus himself says, "For the Father loves the Son." Jesus knew he was loved, and he shows him all that he himself is doing. So this also is at the heart of the identity of the Jesus that we celebrate. He's God's beloved Son. For us, that means that on the one hand, we're called to servanthood, but on the other hand, we're also called to sonship. There's some wonderful things happen, don't they, when we surrender to Jesus and embrace his kingdom. Sins forgiven, a brand new start, a new heart with new desires. But one of the most wonderful things that happens to us is that we become sons. We come to know God as Father. Jesus, of course, is God's eternal Son by generation. We become God's sons by adoption. But we come to enjoy the same love, the same pleasure, the same delight. That's what Jesus prayed. He prays in John 17 that we may be perfectly one and that the world would know that the Father has sent him and has loved us in the same way that the Father has loved him. Think about that for a moment. This consciousness of being thoroughly, fully, completely loved by God the Father. That's what we now get to enjoy through adoption on the basis of what Christ has done for us in his life, death, and resurrection. It's what we enjoy through the power of the Spirit. Paul speaks of how we've not received a spirit of slavery, but a spirit of adoption, through whom we now cry out, Abba, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifying. You feel the Spirit testifying with your spirit? We need that, don't we? It's one of the joys of gathering together as God's children to worship our Father, is as we do that, the Spirit is amongst us and he's testifying to our spirits. Maybe on the back of a week where you felt isolated, where you felt alone, where you felt anxiety, where you've even experienced rejection or the pain of betrayal or misunderstanding. As we gather as his children, the Spirit is amongst us and he's testifying to our spirits. I hope you're experiencing that, enjoying that. That we are children of God. That we are fully, thoroughly, completely loved. That's the Spirit's work as he applies what Christ has made possible in terms of our adoption. And finally, we find he's God's anointed king. The prophet says, he's my servant, my soul delights in him, and he is the one upon whom I've put my Spirit. It's a reference to something that we're not very familiar with, although actually the recent coronation, this was an ingredient of what happened. Some oil was poured upon the king. I think in that moment he was kind of shrouded off, wasn't it? It was such a sacred moment that it was done. It was the one element of the coronation that was done in complete privacy. No cameras on the other side of those curtains. Well, throughout Israel's history, when kings were chosen and set apart, a blend of fine olive oil was poured upon them, usually by the prophets. It was a visible, physical expression of an invisible reality. The power and the presence of the Spirit coming on this individual to enable them to rule and to reign as God's representative on the earth with wisdom and with justice. I have put my Spirit on him, the prophet says. And the pouring out of that oil was called the anointing. The Hebrew word for that is the word Masia. The Greek word is the word Christos. So the Messiah literally means the one who has been anointed with oil, the one who is chosen and set apart and authorized and empowered by God as his representative on planet Earth to extend his kingdom. That's who this servant king is. He's a servant, yep. He's a beloved one, yep. But he is a king. He's come to rule and reign. He's not come to make people nicer. He's not come to give us a fuzzy feeling in December. He has come as God's representative to rule and reign and extend his kingdom on planet Earth. He is Jesus Christ. Christ isn't his surname. It's not like David Lockyer. He's Jesus, the Messiah, the Christ. Christ is a title. It identifies him as the one chosen by God to rule and reign. And that's who this child in the manger in Bethlehem is. That's why the wise men, when they get there, go to Herod and say, "Where's the king? Where is he? We've seen his star rising in the east. Where is the king?" And Herod is so deeply troubled. "I'm the king. I'm in charge round here." "No, there's a new king in town, Herod. Where is he?" It's what comes through in so many of the carols that we sing, isn't it? Hark, the herald angels sing. Glory to who? The newborn king. So who is Jesus? He's God's anointed king. He's the one chosen to rule as God's representative on planet Earth. He's not a philosopher come to enlighten us a little bit, help us understand our human nature a little bit better. He's not even primarily a teacher come to provide us with some wisdom and guidance so that we can become better versions of ourselves. He's not even a supreme example to provide us with a model to emulate and live up to and follow. He is a king, and he's come to establish a kingdom. Isaiah, as we said, received his calling as a prophet in the year that King Uzziah died. He'd been a king for a very long time, and all that Isaiah had known was the kingdom of Isaiah. He went on to live through 3 more kingdoms, the reign of 3 more kings. But God gives him a vision of another kingdom that is to come. One that would stretch across the globe, one within which all nations would be included, a kingdom marked by supreme justice and righteousness. And at the heart of that kingdom to come was a servant king, who, as to his human descent, would be of the line of David, and therefore would be born in a town called Bethlehem. But as to his divine nature, would have an origin and nature from heaven itself. Wonderful Counselor would be his name, Everlasting Father, Mighty God, the Messiah himself. And you know, at a time of international turbulence, this is a great message. There's another prophetic song about this Messiah in the Psalms. It's Psalm 2. I'm just going to read it. We're going to come to an end shortly, and I think maybe just sing once more that song, A Servant King. But let me read Psalm 2, which is, again, another song inspired by the Spirit, looking forward to the reign of this Messiah King. The psalmist says in Psalm chapter 2, "Why do the nations rage?" A lot of rage in the nations at the moment. A lot of rage on all sides. Why? Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together. It's world rulers coming together to try and find solutions to the biggest problems that we face as humanity. Why do they come together? Why do they take counsel against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, "Let us burst their bonds apart and cast their cords from us"? He who sits in the heavens laughs. It's not the laugh of scorn. It's the laugh of someone who knows the end from the beginning. the one who is in total control, the one whose plan and purpose to put it all right has been decided in the council of eternity and will be implemented in history and brought to complete and utter fulfillment one day with a new heavens and a new earth. That's why he laughs. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision, and then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury. As for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree, the Lord said. You are my son. It's there again. A king, a servant, a son. You are my son. Today I've begotten you. Ask of me. I'll make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in your way. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. At a time of international turbulence, at a time of rage, this is a great message. The King has come. We're not looking forward, as Isaiah was, into the future, to some unknown time and moment in history. We are looking back to something that has happened in history. The King has come. He's God's servant. He's God's beloved Son. And he's God's chosen, anointed King. And I want to encourage us to keep him front and center this Christmas season and to appreciate and enjoy and worship him with all our hearts. I wonder if we can finish with that song, Servant King. I realize kids have been in with us. They've done so well. But let's just bring our